Some songs are never supposed to be heard again, until the day they find the one heart that still remembers them. Richard Caldwell never imagined that the sound stopping him cold on a gray Manhattan afternoon would be a melody the world had buried decades ago. His polished Italian shoes slowed against the crowded sidewalk, as if the city itself had reached out to hold him in place. Taxi horns echoed through the avenue. Steam curled from the subway vents. Office workers hurried past with coffee cups balanced in one hand and phones glowing in the other. Nobody else seemed to notice. Nobody else stopped. But Richard did. The 60-year-old billionaire, known across America as the relentless founder of Caldwell Media Group, stood perfectly still outside Grand Central Terminal, while a voice floated through the autumn air with impossible clarity. It wasn't loud. It wasn't polished. It wasn't accompanied by expensive speakers or bright stage lights. It was simply honest, pure. The kind of voice that carried warmth instead of volume. The first few notes slipped through the noise of New York like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds, gentle but impossible to ignore. Richard felt something tighten deep inside his chest before he even recognized the tune. His fingers loosened around the leather briefcase he had carried for years. The polished handle slipped from his hand and landed softly on the pavement. His driver, already holding open the rear door of the waiting black limousine, turned with quiet concern. "Sir?" he asked carefully. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. Every sound around him seemed to fade until only the music remained. His heartbeat slowed. His breathing became shallow. For 16 years, he had trained himself never to revisit that part of his life. He had built companies instead of memories, purchased skyscrapers instead of peace, filled calendars instead of silence. The newspapers called him one of the most disciplined businessmen in America. Investors admired his composure. Rivals feared his precision. Employees respected the distance he kept from everyone around him. But none of them knew the reason music had disappeared from every room he owned. None of them knew why every piano in his mansion had remained closed since the funeral. None of them knew that one unfinished song had become the quiet ghost following him through every success money could buy. Then the singer reached the chorus. Richard's breath caught so suddenly it almost hurt. The words were identical. Every pause, every gentle rise at the end of each line. Even the tiny hesitation before the final phrase was exactly the same. "Impossible," he whispered under his breath. "Absolutely impossible." That melody had never been recorded. It had never been released. It had never appeared on any album, streaming service, or concert stage. Only two people had ever known the complete song: Richard and his late wife, Eleanor. She used to hum it while watching rain collect against their kitchen window during quiet Sunday mornings, before life became consumed by board meetings, acquisitions, and impossible deadlines. She once laughed and called it their invisible treasure because no one else would ever hear it. She had written every lyric inside an old leather notebook she kept hidden in a cedar chest upstairs. After cancer took her away, Richard locked the notebook inside a private safe and never opened it again. Yet somehow the impossible melody now drifted across one of the busiest streets in New York. His eyes searched through the crowd until they found the source. Sitting beside a weathered brick column near the station entrance was a young black boy wrapped in an oversized charcoal hoodie several sizes too large. A faded knit cap covered most of his short curls. Beside him rested an old backpack with frayed straps and a small paper cup holding only a handful of dollar bills and loose change. His sneakers were worn thin at the soles, but they had been carefully cleaned. Resting across his knees was a battered harmonica, whose scratched metal surface reflected faint afternoon light. The boy couldn't have been older than 13. His eyes stayed closed as he sang, completely unaware that one of the wealthiest men in America was staring at him in stunned silence. There was no performance in his expression, no attempt to impress strangers. It felt less like entertainment and more like a quiet conversation with someone only he could hear. Around him, hurried commuters rushed past without slowing down. Some glanced for less than a second before disappearing into the station. Others dropped a coin into the paper cup without ever looking at his face. To most people, he was simply another homeless kid blending into the endless rhythm of the city. But to Richard Caldwell, the boy's voice had just shattered 16 years of carefully built silence. And for the first time since Eleanor was gone, the impossible no longer felt impossible at all. Richard remained where he was long after the final note dissolved into the restless sounds of Manhattan. He watched as the small crowd that had gathered drifted away almost as quickly as it had appeared. A businessman tossed a folded $5 bill into the paper cup without slowing his stride. A little girl smiled shyly before her mother gently guided her toward the station entrance. Within moments, the sidewalk belonged once again to people chasing schedules that never seemed to slow down. The boy quietly opened his eyes and offered a grateful smile to no one in particular. He carefully counted the money inside the cup, not with excitement, but with quiet calculation, as though every dollar already had a purpose waiting for it. Richard expected him to walk toward the nearest restaurant or convenience store. Instead, the boy slipped the bills into the front pocket of his faded backpack, leaving only a few coins behind. He stood, stretched his stiff shoulders beneath the oversized hoodie, picked up the worn harmonica, and disappeared into the moving river of strangers. Without thinking, Richard followed from a respectful distance. His driver called after him, reminding him about a board meeting scheduled in less than 30 minutes. But Richard simply raised one hand without turning around. For the first time in years, billion-dollar negotiations no longer seemed urgent. The boy crossed several busy intersections with the confidence of someone who knew every crack in the sidewalks. He greeted a newspaper vendor with a cheerful wave. He smiled at an elderly crossing guard, who smiled back as though they had repeated the same exchange every afternoon for months. Near Bryant Park, he stopped beside an aging military veteran sitting quietly on a folding chair wrapped in a faded army blanket. The old man looked tired, his silver beard neatly trimmed, despite the hardships written across his weathered face. Without saying a word, the boy reached into his backpack and removed a wrapped turkey sandwich, along with a small bottle of water. He placed both gently into the veteran's hands before continuing down the sidewalk. The older man called after him, "Thank you, Elias." The boy turned with the brightest smile Richard had seen all day. "You eat first, Mr. Henry. I already had breakfast." Richard noticed something that made his chest tighten again. The backpack looked nearly empty after the sandwich was gone. There was no sign that Elias carried another meal for himself. A few blocks later, Elias ducked into the public library. Curious, Richard waited outside beneath the shade of an old maple tree whose orange leaves drifted lazily onto the concrete. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Elias emerged carrying the same backpack, now slightly heavier. Through the open zipper, Richard caught the edges of borrowed books instead of expensive electronics or new clothes. One thick volume was about American music history. Another featured famous gospel singers. A third looked like an old biography of classical composer George Gershwin. Elias hugged them against his chest with remarkable care, as though they were treasures that could never be replaced. The afternoon sun slowly lowered behind the skyline, painting the glass towers in warm shades of gold. As temperatures cooled, Elias made his way beneath a railway overpass several blocks from the station. Hidden from the busy avenue above was a quiet corner where a handful of unhoused people had built a small community of blankets, folding chairs, and carefully organized belongings. Nothing looked careless. Someone had swept away fallen leaves. Empty cans had been collected into neat bags for recycling. A tiny flower rested inside a cracked coffee mug beside one sleeping bag. Elias arrived carrying nothing more than his backpack and harmonica, yet several people greeted him with genuine warmth. An elderly woman with tired eyes smiled when she saw him. "Did the music treat you kindly today?" she asked. Elias nodded modestly. "Good enough for dinner." Before anyone else could respond, he opened his backpack once again. Instead of keeping his earnings hidden, he divided several dollar bills into smaller piles and quietly handed them to two older women and a man struggling to zip his worn winter coat. No speeches, no dramatic gestures. Simply quiet generosity performed with the ease of habit. Richard stood behind the thick concrete support of the overpass, unseen among the lengthening shadows. His mind struggled to understand what he was witnessing. This was not someone waiting for rescue. This was someone quietly rescuing others with almost nothing to give. As evening settled over the city, Elias sat on an overturned milk crate beside a battery-powered lantern. He opened one of the library books and carefully copied handwritten notes into a weathered notebook whose pages were filled with lyrics, musical symbols, and thoughtful observations written in remarkably neat handwriting. Every few minutes he paused to play a gentle phrase on the old harmonica before writing another line. There was discipline in every movement, hope in every page. Richard realized that the impossible song had not been the only remarkable thing about this boy. Hidden beneath worn clothes and uncertain circumstances was a quiet dignity that no amount of hardship had managed to erase. And for reasons he could not yet explain, Richard felt that following the music had led him toward a truth far greater than a forgotten melody. That evening, Richard Caldwell finally returned to the place everyone else expected him to be. The top floor of Caldwell Media Group overlooked the glowing skyline of Manhattan through walls of spotless glass. But the breathtaking view barely registered in his mind. Around the long walnut conference table, senior executives waited with presentation folders neatly arranged beside untouched glasses of sparkling water. Financial projections filled the enormous display screens. Charts climbed upward in confident blue lines. Market analysts discussed acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Normally, Richard noticed every number before anyone else did. He could detect weaknesses hidden inside a spreadsheet with remarkable precision. Investors often joked that he trusted percentages more than people. Tonight, however, every sentence spoken around the room dissolved into meaningless background noise. While his executives debated expansion strategies, another sound continued echoing inside his memory. A young voice, a forgotten melody. A promise that should have vanished 16 years ago. "Sir?" his chief financial officer asked carefully, after repeating the same question twice. Richard blinked and looked toward the conference table. Every face had turned toward him. "Would you like to approve the proposal?" the executive asked again. Richard glanced down at the documents lying before him without truly seeing them. For the first time in decades, he quietly closed the folder. "We will continue tomorrow," he said. A wave of surprised silence settled across the room. Richard had never postponed an important meeting. Not once. Without another explanation, he stood, gathered nothing from the table, and walked toward the elevator. His assistants exchanged puzzled glances behind him, but nobody dared question the decision. Less than an hour later, the gates of his estate opened automatically as the limousine rolled through rows of perfectly trimmed hedges. The mansion stood on nearly 12 acres, overlooking the Hudson River, its limestone walls glowing softly beneath carefully placed landscape lighting. Every detail reflected extraordinary wealth. Marble fountains whispered beneath the evening breeze. Imported oak trees lined the winding driveway. The front entrance towered nearly 20 feet high, framed by elegant columns that had been carved overseas before being shipped piece by piece across the Atlantic. Yet despite its grandeur, the property carried an unmistakable emptiness. No music drifted through open windows. No laughter echoed from the terraces. Even the household staff moved with respectful quiet, as though they instinctively understood that silence had become the permanent language of the home. Margaret Ellis, the longtime house manager, greeted Richard as he stepped inside. She had worked for the family for more than 25 years and knew his routines better than anyone alive. "Would you like dinner served in the dining room, sir?" she asked gently. Richard removed his coat but did not answer immediately. His eyes had settled on the grand piano standing beneath the sweeping staircase. Dust never gathered on its polished surface because Margaret insisted it be cleaned every morning. Still, no one had touched its keys since Eleanor passed away. "No dinner tonight," Richard finally replied. "Thank you, Margaret." She studied him for a brief moment. Something about his face seemed different, not weaker, softer, as though a window long sealed shut had opened just enough to let fresh air inside. "Very well, sir," she answered quietly before disappearing down the hallway. Richard walked slowly through rooms filled with priceless paintings and handcrafted furniture collected from around the world. Every object represented success. Every room reflected achievement. Yet none of them offered comfort. He climbed the curved staircase and entered the private study that had remained almost exactly as Eleanor left it years earlier. Books still rested in perfect rows along the shelves. A framed photograph captured the two of them laughing during a charity concert in Nashville, long before fame and fortune consumed their schedules. On another shelf sat a cedar box that had not been opened in 16 years. Richard stood before it for several silent seconds, His fingertips rested lightly against the smooth wood. Finally, he unlocked the small brass clasp and slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay neatly folded letters, tied together with a pale blue ribbon. Beneath them rested an aging leather notebook with worn corners softened by years of careful use. Richard gently opened the first page. Eleanor's graceful handwriting appeared exactly as he remembered, elegant and patient. Every page contained fragments of melodies, unfinished lyrics, personal reflections, and small sketches drawn while inspiration visited unexpectedly. As he carefully turned another page, his breathing stopped. There it was, the song, every word, every note, every pause. Exactly as the boy had sung it that afternoon beneath the station entrance. Richard lowered himself into the leather chair beside the window. Moonlight spilled across the notebook while the city shimmered quietly beyond the glass. He read the lyrics again. Then, once more. There could be no coincidence, no accidental resemblance. Whoever taught Elias that melody had known Eleanor personally. The realization settled over him with remarkable calm rather than shock. For 16 years, Richard had believed the final chapter of his wife's story ended inside that notebook. Tonight, a homeless boy with a weathered harmonica had quietly reopened a page. Richard never believed life would allow him to read again. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn light that spilled between the towers of Midtown Manhattan. Richard Caldwell woke before sunrise, something he had not done without an alarm in years. Sleep had come only in scattered moments, interrupted each time by the same gentle melody replaying inside his mind. Instead of heading directly toward another board meeting, he chose a simple navy overcoat, left behind the expensive cufflinks that usually completed his appearance, and instructed his driver to stop 3 blocks away from Grand Central Terminal. "Wait here," Richard said quietly before stepping onto the sidewalk alone. He wanted no security team, no assistance, no attention. For once, he wished to be nothing more than another passerby in the crowd. The morning rush had already begun. Fresh coffee drifted from nearby cafes. Newspapers rustled beneath impatient hands. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves mixed with the distant warmth of baked bread from a corner bakery. Richard reached the familiar brick column where he had first heard the impossible song. The space was empty. Only a few scattered maple leaves rested against the concrete where the paper cup had stood the day before. He waited. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became nearly an hour. Just as he considered leaving, he noticed a familiar oversized charcoal hoodie emerging from the station entrance. Elias carried his backpack over one shoulder while balancing a small paper bag in his hands. Before unpacking his harmonica, he walked directly toward a sanitation worker sweeping the sidewalk nearby. "Good morning, Mr. Lewis," Elias said with an easy smile. "I brought an extra muffin. They gave me 2 at the shelter." The older man laughed warmly. "You should keep it, young man. You need it more than I do." Elias gently shook his head. "Sharing makes breakfast taste better." Mr. Lewis accepted the muffin with quiet gratitude. Richard watched the exchange without revealing himself. There was no audience. No cameras, no expectation of praise. The kindness seemed as natural to Elias as breathing. A few minutes later, Elias settled onto the familiar spot beside the column. Instead of beginning to sing immediately, he removed a small notebook from his backpack. Richard recognized it from the previous evening, beneath the overpass. Elias carefully reviewed several handwritten pages, softly humming different melodies under his breath, before making tiny corrections with a well-used pencil. His concentration reminded Richard of Eleanor during her own songwriting sessions. She always believed music deserved patience before performance. When Elias finally lifted the harmonica to his lips, Richard stepped forward. "That is a beautiful instrument," he said gently. Elias looked up, surprised but not frightened. He offered a polite smile. "Thank you, sir. It is old, but it still has good songs inside." Richard returned the smile. "May I sit here for a moment?" Elias glanced at the empty stretch of stone beside him and nodded. "Of course. The sidewalk belongs to everybody." Richard lowered himself onto the cool concrete ledge, something unimaginable to anyone who knew the billionaire's carefully controlled public image. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. They simply watched commuters hurry toward another busy day. Finally, Richard asked, How long have you been playing? Elias looked down at the harmonica resting in his hands. Since I was about 6. I could not read music back then, so my mother taught me everything by listening first. Richard felt his heartbeat quicken. Your mother taught you that song you sang yesterday? Elias's expression softened with quiet affection. Yes, sir. She said it was her favorite song in the whole world. Richard kept his voice calm despite the questions racing through his mind. Did she write it? Elias slowly shook his head. No. She always told me it belonged to someone she loved very much. She promised that if I sang it with kindness instead of pride, maybe one day it would find the person who needed it most. Richard looked away toward the moving traffic, allowing himself a slow breath before speaking again. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. Elias smiled, although sadness briefly crossed his face. She was. She believed songs could carry hope farther than people could. The words settled between them like leaves floating onto still water. Richard studied the young boy beside him. There was wisdom in his quiet confidence that felt far older than 13 years. He did not complain about sleeping outdoors. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply carried hope from one day to the next with astonishing grace. Nearby, the station clock chimed 9 times. The city continued racing forward without noticing the unlikely conversation unfolding beside an ordinary brick column. But Richard sensed that every answer Elias offered was gently leading him toward an even greater mystery, one that had been waiting patiently through 16 silent years for this very morning. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat and slowly removed a slim leather wallet. Without making a show of it, he selected several $100 bills and folded them together before extending them toward Elias. Please, he said gently, take this. Buy yourself a warm place to sleep, a good meal, new shoes, whatever you need. Elias looked at the money for only a brief second before lifting his eyes back to Richard. There was no excitement in his expression, no disbelief, and certainly no greed. Instead, he smiled with quiet gratitude and softly shook his head. That is very kind of you, sir, but I cannot accept all of that. Richard frowned slightly. Throughout his career, he had watched countless people compete for his attention whenever money entered a conversation. Some disguised their requests with elaborate stories. Others simply asked directly. Yet this young boy seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the offer. Why not? Richard asked. Because it is too much, Elias answered honestly. I did not earn it. Richard studied him for a moment before replying. You earned it the moment you shared your music. Elias gently rested the harmonica across his knees. Music is a gift. Gifts are meant to be shared, not sold. The words landed with surprising weight. Richard slowly lowered the bills, but did not put them away. Then let me help you another way. Elias thought quietly before pointing toward a small bakery across the street. Warm bread aromas drifted through the cool morning air every time the front door opened. If you really want to help, would you buy 2 turkey sandwiches and 4 bowls of soup from there? Richard looked surprised. 4 bowls? Elias nodded. Mr. Henry has been coughing since yesterday, and Miss Clara says warm soup helps her hands feel better when the weather changes. Mr. Lewis already has breakfast because of the muffin, but there are 2 other people under the bridge who have not eaten since yesterday afternoon. Richard glanced back toward the bakery, and then toward the folded bills still resting in his hand. And what about you? Elias smiled. 1 sandwich is enough for me. Without another word, Richard crossed the street and entered the bakery. The young cashier immediately recognized him from television, but politely kept her excitement to herself. Richard purchased every bowl of soup they had prepared for the lunch rush, along with several fresh sandwiches, fruit cups, bottles of water, and warm rolls. When the employees offered to package everything separately, he asked them to keep the bags light enough for a young teenager to carry comfortably. A few minutes later, Richard returned balancing several paper bags. Elias laughed softly. That is much more than I asked for. Richard smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in years. Perhaps I wanted to contribute a little extra. Together, they carried the food toward the quiet community beneath the railway overpass. The walk took nearly 15 minutes. Along the way, Elias greeted nearly everyone they passed by name. A florist arranging buckets of chrysanthemums outside her shop waved cheerfully. A bus driver honked twice before giving a thumbs up through the windshield. Even a police officer walking his morning patrol smiled warmly. Richard realized something remarkable. Elias had almost nothing, yet he belonged everywhere he went. People did not see him as invisible. They saw him as someone who made their day a little brighter. When they arrived beneath the overpass, the familiar faces looked up with pleasant surprise. Mr. Henry smiled broadly at the sight of the paper bags. Miss Clara carefully folded the blanket she had been repairing and stood to help distribute the meals. Elias handed each person food before opening his own sandwich. No one received less than anyone else. Richard noticed that Elias quietly set aside the largest apple and the warmest container of soup for an elderly woman who had been sleeping when they arrived. "She gets cold easily," Elias whispered when he noticed Richard watching. "She never asks for anything, so I try to remember before she has to." Richard felt an unfamiliar ache settle inside his chest. He had spent decades building charitable foundations that donated millions of dollars every year. Yet those gifts had always traveled through committees, reports, and annual meetings. Elias gave differently. He gave attention. He remembered names. He noticed who needed the warmest meal, instead of simply making sure everyone received one. As the small group quietly shared lunch beneath the shelter of the overpass, laughter gradually replaced the morning chill. Steam rose gently from the soup containers while sunlight filtered through the steel beams overhead, casting long golden lines across the pavement. Richard sat on an overturned wooden crate with a simple paper bowl resting in his hands. No reporters photographed the moment. No headlines would praise his generosity. Yet somehow this ordinary lunch tasted more satisfying than any formal banquet he had attended in years. Looking across at Elias laughing with people the world often overlooked, Richard realized the boy had refused his fortune without rejecting his kindness, and in doing so had quietly taught one of the richest men in America that generosity measured by dollars could never equal generosity measured by the heart. That evening, the sky over Manhattan faded from soft amber into deep shades of blue, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the quiet streets. Richard returned to his estate later than usual, but unlike every evening before, he did not head toward his office or the endless stack of reports waiting on his desk. Instead, he walked directly to the music room, a place he had carefully avoided for 16 long years. The room had remained perfectly preserved, as though time itself had been instructed not to disturb it. The grand piano stood beneath the tall windows, where the last traces of daylight reflected across its polished black surface. Shelves filled with handwritten scores lined one wall, untouched except for careful dusting. Eleanor had loved this room more than any other place in the house because she believed music deserved sunlight before applause. Richard slowly crossed the hardwood floor until he reached the piano bench. He lowered himself onto the worn leather cushion and rested both hands on the closed keyboard without lifting the lid. The silence inside the room felt different now. It no longer resembled loneliness. It felt as though something patient had been waiting for him all these years. Outside, rain began falling lightly against the tall windows, creating a gentle rhythm that reminded him of quiet Sunday afternoons from another lifetime. He opened the cedar notebook once again and turned carefully to the familiar page. The lyrics looked exactly as they always had, but now every line carried a voice, instead of only ink. Elias had somehow given life back to words Richard believed had been buried forever. He closed his eyes and, for the first time since Eleanor passed away, allowed himself to remember without fear. He remembered flour dusted across her sweater as she laughed while baking fresh bread. He remembered her singing softly while watering flowers on the back terrace. He remembered evenings when she would stop writing in the middle of a sentence, simply because she had discovered a melody worth chasing. The memories no longer arrived like painful reminders. They arrived like warm light returning through an old window. Richard finally lifted the piano lid. His fingers hovered uncertainly above the ivory keys. Years had passed since they had touched a single note. Slowly, almost cautiously, he pressed the first chord. The sound echoed gently through the empty room. Then another, and another. His movements were hesitant, imperfect, but gradually, the forgotten melody emerged from beneath his fingertips. It was slower than Elias had sung it, weighted by years of silence, yet unmistakably the same song. Richard stopped halfway through the chorus as emotion caught unexpectedly in his throat. He lowered his hands and stared quietly at the keys, while rain continued tracing gentle patterns across the glass. Downstairs, Margaret paused outside the music room. She had been carrying a tray with tea she assumed would remain untouched. But when she heard the piano, she simply stood in the hallway. Moisture gathered quietly in her eyes. During 16 years of service, she had never once heard those keys played again. She did not interrupt. She simply placed the tray outside the door and walked away with the faintest smile. Richard remained alone beside the piano until darkness completely surrounded the estate. Eventually, he rose and walked toward the large window overlooking the river. Across the water, thousands of lights shimmered against the black surface like distant stars floating on gentle waves. He realized that throughout his life, he had believed success meant controlling every outcome, solving every problem, and protecting himself from every loss. Yet a homeless 13-year-old carrying a worn harmonica had quietly accomplished what unimaginable wealth never could. He had reopened a heart that grief had carefully locked away. Richard reached into his coat pocket and found the small piece of paper Elias had slipped into one of the bakery bags earlier that afternoon. He unfolded it slowly. Written in careful handwriting were only a few simple words. "My mother always said that songs find people exactly when they are ready to listen." Richard read the sentence several times before carefully placing it inside Eleanor's notebook. The house remained silent, but it was no longer an empty silence. It breathed with quiet hope. Beyond the rain-covered windows, the city continued rushing through another ordinary night, unaware that inside one lonely mansion, healing had begun not with power, not with money, but with the gentle kindness of a boy who had never... The following morning arrived beneath a clear October sky. And for the first time in many years, Richard Caldwell canceled every meeting on his calendar without offering an explanation. His executive assistant protested politely, reminding him that investors had flown in from 3 different states, but Richard simply smiled and said, "Some things cannot wait another day." Less than an hour later, he found Elias sitting beneath the familiar brick column, quietly polishing the scratched harmonica with the edge of a clean handkerchief. The boy looked up and smiled as though he had expected Richard to return. "Good morning, sir," he said warmly. "Did you play the song?" Richard stopped in surprise. "How did you know I would?" Elias shrugged with a gentle laugh. "Your hands looked like someone who used to play piano. My mother always noticed things like that." Richard sat beside him once again. "I did play it." Elias's smile grew brighter. "Then she was right." Richard tilted his head. "Who?" "My mother," Elias answered. "She always said the song was asleep, not gone. She believed one day somebody would wake it up again." Richard remained silent for several moments before asking the question that had weighed on him since they first met. "Elias, what was your mother's name?" The boy carefully placed the harmonica inside his backpack before answering. "Grace Brooks." Richard searched his memory, but the name did not immediately return anything familiar. Seeing the uncertainty on his face, Elias continued. "Most people knew her as Grace, but when she was younger, everyone at church called her Amazing Grace because she could make an entire room smile with just one song." Richard's breathing slowed. Somewhere deep inside his memory, a nearly forgotten image flickered. Eleanor had once spoken about a young gospel singer she met while volunteering at a neighborhood music program in Brooklyn more than 20 years earlier. They had spent an entire summer writing songs together before life carried them in different directions. Richard had never met the young woman himself, but he remembered Eleanor mentioning one detail again and again. "She sings hope better than anyone I have ever heard." Richard looked back toward Elias. "Did your mother ever know a woman named Eleanor Caldwell?" Elias's eyes widened with quiet recognition. "Of course. She talked about Miss Eleanor all the time." Richard felt his heart skip. "She did?" Elias nodded enthusiastically. "They used to write songs together before I was born. My mother kept a small photograph inside her Bible. They were sitting on the front steps of an old church with notebooks on their laps. Every birthday she would tell me the same story. She said Miss Eleanor taught her that music was not about having the biggest voice. It was about helping someone carry tomorrow when today felt too heavy." Richard stared quietly at the sidewalk, unable to speak. 16 years of unanswered questions suddenly began fitting together with astonishing clarity. "What happened?" he finally whispered. Elias lowered his eyes. "Life happened. My mother became sick a few years ago. Before she passed away, she gave me the harmonica and taught me that song. She told me never to sing it for attention, only sing it when my heart stayed kind. She believed that if I protected the song, someday it would lead me to someone who still needed her friendship. Richard swallowed hard. Did she ever tell you why she stopped seeing Eleanor? Elias slowly reached into his backpack and carefully removed a small envelope whose edges had softened with age. She said she never stopped caring. They simply lived in different worlds after Miss Eleanor married and became famous beside you. My mother did not want anyone thinking she was asking for help, so she quietly stepped away. But she kept every letter Miss Eleanor ever mailed. Richard accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Inside rested a faded photograph of two young women laughing beneath the stained glass windows of a modest Brooklyn church. Eleanor looked years younger, wearing blue jeans instead of elegant gowns. Beside her stood Grace Brooks, holding a guitar, while sunlight spilled across both of their smiling faces. Folded behind the picture was a handwritten note in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. No matter where life takes us, promise me our songs will always belong to hope. Richard gently closed his eyes. At that moment he understood the truth that had remained hidden all these years. The melody had not survived because it was famous. It had survived because two ordinary women had trusted kindness more than recognition. One had preserved it inside a notebook, the other had carried it inside her heart until she placed it into the hands of her son. And now, through Elias, a friendship that time, distance, and sorrow had never truly broken, had quietly found its way home. Richard carefully folded Eleanor's note and placed it back inside the envelope before handing it to Elias with both hands. "This belongs to your family," he said softly. Elias accepted it with quiet respect and slipped it safely into his backpack beside the harmonica. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The sounds of Manhattan continued all around them, subway trains rumbling beneath the streets, traffic lights changing, footsteps crossing the sidewalks. Yet beneath the old brick column, time itself seemed to move more slowly. Richard finally looked toward Elias with a warmth that had not appeared on his face in many years. "Would you allow me to show you something?" he asked. Elias smiled politely. "If it is not too far. Mr. Henry worries when I disappear without telling him." Richard nodded immediately. "Then we will tell him first." Together they walked beneath the railway overpass, where the small community welcomed Richard with familiar smiles instead of curiosity. Mr. Henry listened quietly, as Richard explained that he wanted to take Elias somewhere for the afternoon and promised he would bring him back before sunset. The older veteran studied Richard for a long moment before extending his weathered hand. "The boy trusts people carefully," he said. "Do not give him a reason to stop." Richard shook his hand firmly. "I will not." Less than an hour later, Elias sat inside the limousine for the first time in his life. He ran his fingers lightly across the soft leather seat, not with excitement over luxury, but with simple curiosity. Looking through the wide windows, he watched the city pass by exactly as he always had from sidewalks and buses, only now from a different perspective. "Everything looks smaller from in here," Elias said quietly. Richard smiled. "Sometimes it does." Elias looked out again before answering. "I think I like seeing people up close better." Richard nodded thoughtfully, realizing that the boy had just summarized something wealth had slowly hidden from him over the years. When the limousine reached the Caldwell estate, the massive iron gates opened silently. Elias gazed at the endless gardens, the fountains, and the towering limestone mansion without saying a word. Richard expected amazement, but instead the boy asked softly, "Does it ever feel lonely with so much space?" The question lingered gently in the air. Richard looked toward the empty balconies and quiet windows. Until recently, he admitted, it felt lonely every single day. Margaret welcomed them at the entrance, with the same kindness she offered every guest. She greeted Elias by name after Richard introduced him and personally led him toward the dining room, where a simple lunch had been prepared instead of the elaborate meals usually served during business gatherings. Fresh vegetable soup, roasted chicken, warm bread, fruit, and iced tea filled the table. Elias quietly waited until everyone had taken a seat before beginning to eat. His manners reflected quiet gratitude rather than formal training. Margaret noticed immediately. "Your mother taught you well," she said gently. Elias smiled. "She always said good manners are free, so everyone can afford them." Margaret lowered her eyes for a moment, touched by the simple wisdom. After lunch, Richard led Elias into the music room. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, filling the room with warm afternoon light. The grand piano stood exactly where it always had, but today the room no longer felt frozen in grief. Richard opened the lid and rested his hands upon the keys. "Would you sing it once more?" he asked quietly. Elias nodded. As Richard began playing the familiar melody, Elias joined with the same gentle voice that had first stopped a billionaire on a crowded Manhattan sidewalk. The music filled every corner of the room, floating through the open doorway and into the quiet hallways beyond. Margaret paused while arranging flowers. Two gardeners working outside lifted their heads toward the open windows. Even the household staff slowed their footsteps without realizing why. It was not simply a beautiful song anymore. It had become a bridge connecting memories, friendship, loss, forgiveness, and hope across two generations. When the final note faded, neither Richard nor Elias spoke. They simply allowed the silence to settle naturally around them. Finally, Richard turned toward the boy with quiet determination. "Elias, I cannot replace your mother, and I will never try. But I would like to honor both her and Eleanor in the way they deserved." Elias listened carefully. "How?" Richard smiled gently. "Not by giving you everything, by giving you the opportunity to become everything they already believed you could be." He walked to the window overlooking the gardens, where golden leaves drifted slowly across the lawn. "I am creating the Grace and Eleanor Music Foundation. It will provide instruments, music lessons, scholarships, and safe places for children whose gifts might otherwise go unheard. You will not owe me anything. I only ask one thing in return." Elias looked up. "What is that?" Richard's eyes reflected the warm afternoon light. "Promise me you will keep singing the way your mother taught you, with kindness instead of pride." Elias smiled, and without hesitation he extended his hand. "I promise." 8 months later, the first warm evening of spring settled gently over Manhattan, and the restored Madison Performing Arts Theater glowed beneath thousands of golden lights. Families filled every seat inside the historic hall. Teachers, musicians, students, veterans, neighborhood volunteers, and children from every corner of the city gathered beneath the grand ceiling painted with stars. The banner stretching across the stage carried simple words that reflected everything the evening represented. The Grace and Eleanor Music Foundation First Annual Concert. There were no celebrity performances, no expensive publicity stunts. Every young performer had earned a place through dedication, perseverance, and heart. Backstage, Elias Brooks adjusted the sleeves of a neatly pressed navy suit that had been tailored just for him. The worn harmonica still rested safely inside his jacket pocket, not because he needed it for the performance, but because he never wanted to forget where his journey began. His library notebook had grown thick with new songs, new dreams, and new possibilities. He still visited Mr. Henry, Miss Clara, and the small community beneath the railway overpass every week, although many of them now had stable housing through programs supported by local organizations Richard quietly partnered with. Some things had changed. Kindness had not. Margaret stepped backstage carrying a small bouquet of white lilies. "Someone asked me to give these to you," she said with a smile. Elias recognized the flowers immediately. They had been Eleanor's favorite. Tucked between the stems rested a handwritten note from Richard. "Your mother once protected a song. Tonight you protect hope. I could not be more proud." Elias carefully folded the note and placed it beside the old envelope containing Eleanor's letter to Grace. When the stage manager announced that only 2 minutes remained, Elias closed his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered cold mornings outside Grand Central Terminal. He remembered borrowed blankets beneath the railway overpass. He remembered his mother's gentle voice reminding him that songs should never be used to make someone feel small. They should help someone stand a little taller. The curtain slowly opened. Warm applause filled the theater as Elias walked toward the grand piano waiting beneath a single golden spotlight. He paused for one quiet breath before sitting on the polished bench. Across the auditorium, Richard Caldwell occupied a simple seat in the final row instead of the reserved section prepared for donors and honored guests. He had politely declined every public introduction that evening. The foundation was never meant to celebrate his generosity. It existed to continue the kindness of two women whose friendship had quietly changed far more lives than either of them had ever known. Richard folded his hands together and watched silently as Elias looked toward the audience with calm confidence. The first piano notes floated into the theater with gentle warmth. Moments later, Elias began singing. The melody was familiar, but something inside it had changed. It no longer carried only memory. It carried tomorrow. Around the auditorium, people listened without speaking. Some smiled through quiet tears. Others reached gently for the hands of loved ones beside them. No one knew every chapter of the story behind the song, yet somehow every heart understood its meaning. High above the stage, soft lights reflected across the polished wood of the piano, while spring rain began falling lightly beyond the theater windows. Richard lifted his eyes toward the ceiling for a brief moment, and in the peaceful silence between verses, he found himself smiling instead of grieving. He could almost imagine Eleanor and Grace somewhere beyond sight, still laughing together with notebooks resting across their knees, still believing that kindness would always travel farther than fear. When the final note faded, the audience rose to its feet in grateful applause, but Elias remained seated for one extra heartbeat, quietly touching the harmonica inside his pocket before standing to acknowledge the crowd. His eyes searched the auditorium until they found Richard in the final row. The billionaire did not wave. He simply placed one hand over his heart and nodded. Elias returned the gesture with the same quiet smile he had offered strangers outside the station months before. No words were necessary. Outside, the rain had already stopped. Fresh air drifted through the city as people slowly stepped onto the sidewalks beneath a sky clearing to reveal the first stars of evening. Somewhere in the distance, a young child, leaving the concert, softly hummed the melody while walking beside her parents. Another child joined in a few steps later. The song continued moving forward, carried not by fame or fortune, but by ordinary voices willing to share hope with someone else. And beneath the gentle glow of the theater lights, where one forgotten melody had finally found its way home, the quiet sound of compassion became the richest legacy anyone could ever leave behind.